Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Judith Rolls, and I'm the Senior Associate Director for Alumni and Family Engagement at Davidson College. I'm joined by my colleague Adam Barton, who is our Digital Events Manager, and Anna Watson, who is our Digital Events Fellow. We're thrilled to welcome each of you to this back to school class featuring Bill Link, Davidson class of 1976. In a moment, we'll turn the program over to Bill for further introductions. Before we do, I just want to share a few quick announcements. First, all participants have been muted. Please remain muted throughout the event so we are able to hear our presenter. If you're comfortable with it and have not already changed your Zoom name to your first and last name, we ask that you would consider to do so now. You can rename yourself by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your screen and hovering over with your mouse over your name and then clicking the more or ellipses 3 dots button. If you have a Davidson class year, feel free to add that as well. If you have questions for the presenter during the presentation, please use the chat feature also found at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the chat button, you may need to click more, another button at the bottom of your screen. The presenter will do their best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of his presentation. If you have technical or other issues, please also post them in the chat. Our staff is going to be watching the chat during the call. We have enabled the auto transcription for this call. If you'd like to enable it on your end, you can click the Show Closed Caption or CC button also on your screen, and subtitles should appear. Please note that these captions are not always accurate, so we appreciate your understanding. And now for our program. William A. Link is the Richard J. Milbauer Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Florida, where he taught for 22 years. Prior to his stint at University of Florida, he taught for 23 years at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's written extensively about the history of the South during the 19th and 20th centuries. Please join me in welcoming Bill Link, a graduate of the Davidson class of 1976.
Well, thank you, Judith, for that introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this presentation. I wanted to say a few things to begin with, sort of, I guess they're warnings. First of all, I'm not an expert on Watergate. As Judith indicated, I'm a historian of the South, but I've taught a course on Watergate 3 times. So the in a way, that's almost better than writing about it. Teaching about it is always better. The other thing I wanted to mention is the prevalence of Watergate in popular culture. It's really sort of amazing to me how many people 50 years after recognize what Watergate was, and have some sense of what happened with Watergate. It has a particular relevance for the class of 76. We started in the fall of 1972, just as Richard Nixon was being reelected and just as the Watergate scandal was beginning to unfold in the spring of 1973. So what I want to do tonight, and I'm very eager to hear your comments and questions, I want to start with a sort of a brief discussion of background, sort of origin story of how Watergate came into existence, what the factors were, um, and then spend some time talking about the highlights. It's very easy to sort of slip into the weeds with the subject, so I'm going to try to move kind of quickly through that. And then finally, sort of look at the aftermath of Watergate and what some of the implications of Watergate are for American politics and American society in the 21st century. So the break-in, which is the sort of origin story of the Watergate crisis, occurred June 17th, 1972. 5 Watergate burglars were arrested. Um, it led to more than 2 years later the resignation of a president. So it's a complicated sort of story, but an interesting one nonetheless. Um, so origins. To start with, Watergate in many ways reflected the growth of the presidency, presidential power. When you think about the Constitution, how the Constitution defined the presidency in 1787, Article 2 of the Constitution sets a number of things in which a president has implied power. Um, so in the course of the 20th century, especially, there's been a great sort of increase in presidential power as a result of a variety of factors. But one way to measure this is to look at the size of White House staff. I'll talk about that in a second. Um, Arthur Schlesinger's Imperial Presidency is sort of a groundbreaking book, Pulitzer Prize winning book. It was written in 1973, right at the height of the Watergate crisis. And Schlesinger, who was a historian at Harvard, among other places, um, described the rise of presidential power way beyond what the Constitution had originally defined the presidency under Article 2. Um, and as I indicated earlier, one measure of this is the growth of White House staff. It's really quite remarkable in the 20th century, especially. In 1900, presidency of William McKinley, White House staff was under 10. Woodrow Wilson, at the height of World War I, had a White House staff of under 15. You go from that, and if you look at this chart, pretty clearly what happens is that uh, the growth of the White House, as measured by the expansion of staff, really took off with the Great Depression and World War II, with the New Deal and the expansion of presidential power during World War II, and then the Cold War. So you had, over the course of time, a whole national security state that emerged that was a function of the Cold War and reflected Cold War priorities. So presidential power lies, a lot of it's implied. Um, a lot of it is not limited. But there's some aspects of presidential power that aren't even in the Constitution. So, for example, executive privilege, which is probably familiar to you all because it's something that has been used recently to avoid disclosure by the White House. Executive privilege doesn't exist in the Constitution. And in fact, it wasn't used at all by presidents on any regular basis until Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. Executive orders, we have a lot of those in the Trump presidency. Those also are not defined in the Constitution. This is something that was simply asserted. Um, the first big user of executive orders was Theodore Roosevelt. He used a lot of basically legislation by president in order to do a number of things that he couldn't get through Congress. And that's executive orders often reflect a president not able to do things through legislation. War-making powers, that's another sort of scene in which, or area in which presidential power has grown, especially during the 20th century with the world wars and the Cold War. The expansion of the administrative state, the growth of regulation, really, intervention by the federal government, the expansion of the size of the federal government. And then, as I've mentioned just a second ago, national security and secrecy. Presidential power is very often secret, and secrecy becomes a part of the whole system. So that's some background. We entered into this mix and sort of trying to work toward understanding what happened here. Um, the particular personality of Richard M. Nixon, Richard Milhous Nixon. Nixon, a very interesting character. He grew up in poverty in Southern California, lost two of his brothers to tuberculosis, and was constantly striving to improve himself, which he did, um, but always had kind of a chip on his shoulder. There was always an element of paranoia. There was a dark side to Richard Nixon. Um, he was elected to Congress in 1948 and then the U.S. Senate in 1950. And in both campaigns, he went negative. So he practiced the really the sort of no holds barred approach to politics and making sure that he won, which is important. He was president during the 1960s. Nixon was, of course, Eisenhower's vice president. He ran for president in 1960 against Jack Kennedy in a very close election. Kennedy won. Nixon was defeated, and Nixon began a long comeback. And then in 1968 was elected president. 1968 was a very troubled year in American history. It was the peak of the 1960s. A variety of things were going on. Um, just to list a few of them. Civil rights movement, which occurred, sort of culminated with the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. The rise of the New Left, Vietnam, the counterculture, Chicano movement, American Indian movement, gay liberation. These are all things that sort of arose in the 1950s. And to some people, perhaps most Americans, this seemed as though society was falling apart. There was a kind of a fear, sort of a backlash that occurred at the end of the 1960s. And actually, Nixon's election in 68, in large part, represented that. So there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, particularly about Black Power. Um, the civil rights movement sort of evolved into Black Power by the late 1960s. This is a very threatening image, especially to white people. This is an image of Black Panthers, of course. Panthers came into existence in the West Coast and Oakland, came into existence as a group attempting to defend against police violence against Black people. And then there's also the counterculture. Um, what better example than the revolutions of the 1960s that you had with the counterculture, the sexual revolution, the change in the roles of women, a whole host of things that are going on in the 1960s that many Americans, frankly, found very troubling. Vietnam. America was fully involved in Vietnam by the time Nixon was elected in 1968. Vietnam was um, a disaster in many respects. Um, it was a war that was fought um, and uh, without a clear exit strategy. But it evoked numerous protests. This is a chart that shows the peak of American ground troops in Vietnam. It peaks in 1969, over 500,000. By the time Nixon left office, of course, he had totally withdrawn American troops. Still, the anti-war movement was a major factor driving the protests of the 1960s. Resistance against the draft, resistance against participation in the war. And a lot of this began to affect Nixon. Nixon was elected in 68. The protests, the anti-war protests peaked really in 69, 70, 71, uh, peaking really with the invasion of Cambodia that occurred in May 1970 and um, widespread protests that emerged in the spring of 1970 as a result of the invasion of Cambodia and the widening of the war that occurred. So a variety of things are going on here. The Nixon, and added into this is the ingredient of Nixon's particular political persona. Um, and paranoia probably isn't an exaggeration to describe the feeling of the Nixon White House as it evolves. There are a number of leaks that take place in the White House. Most White House have leaks. That's sort of a common practice. Um, and Nixon was very interested in plugging those leaks. This became almost an obsession on his part. Um, so what he wanted, one of his early attempts to sort of coordinate intelligence gathering against domestic opposition was the Houston Plan, which was proposed in 1970. Basically, it was a plan to consolidate the intelligence services under White House control. There's an image here of Nixon with J. Edgar Hoover. Of course, it was the director of the FBI. Put simply, Hoover vetoed the plan. But Nixon continued to be frustrated about the inability to control leaks and also about the threat that domestic dissent represented. All of this kind of came together in the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Pentagon Papers were an officially designated, officially uh, sanctioned study of the history of American involvement in Vietnam. It went to 42 or 43 volumes. It was a thoroughgoing examination, and for the most part, it was not complimentary. The Pentagon Papers chart a sort of long history of deceit and mistakes that were made by American presidents. It was secret. The Pentagon Papers become important when Daniel Ellsberg, who worked as one of the authors in the study, um, disclosed the papers. He leaked the Pentagon Papers, to the New York Times in June of 1971. So it went to the Supreme Court. Nixon immediately challenged um, uh, whether the New York Times could produce or could reproduce any part of the Pentagon Papers. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the New York Times. It's a big, big movement, big sort of development in the Nixon White House. Um, so this is sort of a turning point, I think, in many ways. Nixon, once you get to 71 with the Pentagon Papers, there's sort of a momentum that builds toward Watergate as a result. June 13th, I have a timeline here. June 13th, 1971, the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers. And then in July of 71, um, the White House Special Investigation Unit was officially established. And the purpose of that was to get to the leaks and to plug them. Um, the the White House group that was organized, this was, again, sort of reflected the failure of the Houston plan. Um, this was a group organized out of the White House to plug leaks. They were known as the plumbers because they were going to plug leaks. And they included a variety of sort of interesting cast of characters. The nominal head of the plumbers was G. Gordon Liddy, former FBI agent and lawyer. He was one of the two chief organizers of the plumbers. The other was E. Howard Hunt. Um, Liddy had experience in the FBI. Hunt's experience was in the CIA. He was a CIA operative. He'd been one of the critical uh, figures in the Bay of Pigs disaster of 1961. Liddy and Hunt are the two key players here in the plumbers. And their first big event was to burglarize the offices of Lewis Fielding, who was um, Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. It was bungled, but it became sort of the opening act in the plumbers, uh, and the plumbers become important later on. Now, subsequently, the plumbers um, became a sort of a political um, intelligence operation. And added to this group was James McCord, another CIA operative who was an expert in electronic surveillance. And he's one of the people that was caught at the Watergate Hotel on June 17th, 1972. I mentioned the Lewis Fielding break-in. This is the psychiatrist of Ellsberg, September 3rd, 1971. By early 1972, a sort of more coherent plan of political espionage has emerged in the Nixon White House, known as Operation Gemstone. And the person behind it was uh, Gordon Liddy. And Liddy went to the Nixon campaign, the Committee to Re-elect the President. Its acronym was CREEP. It went to the Nixon campaign, and Liddy went and asked in January 1972, asked for $1 million to finance a widespread sort of political espionage campaign against the Democratic candidate for president in 1972. Um, Liddy's plans were trimmed back, but he was given the go-ahead to begin acts of political espionage. Gemstone reflected Nixon's desire to compile intelligence on Democratic candidates and party officials, particularly Lawrence O'Brien. Um, and so all of this really kind of comes to a head in 1972 with the election of 1972. Nixon was obviously determined to be reelected. His opponent in 1972 was George McGovern, and the Nixon campaign in 72 ran against McGovern, defining him as an extreme left candidate. He was an anti-war candidate. Um, Nixon was not particularly popular, but the negative campaigning worked to his advantage in 72. And Watergate, in a sense, comes out of the campaign of 1972. Nixon, um, through his committee to reelect the president, um, began and sanctioned political espionage. This is John Mitchell, who was the chairman of the Nixon campaign in 1972. He was also Attorney General under Nixon. So they engage in a variety of things. Watergate is only one of them. There, for example, was a fairly active dirty tricks operation. This would be planting false stories, um, uh, sort of spoofing people in order to throw them off their game. Donald Segretti is probably one of the major figures. The other person that's important in this is Roger Stone, who's another one involved in dirty tricks. Segretti was involved in New Hampshire primary, and he used these techniques to discredit Edmund Muskie, who was perceived as a more credible kind of a candidate in 1972 to run against Nixon. He was more moderate. So there's Roger Stone. Roger Stone loved Nixon, has a tattoo of Nixon on his back. The result of 72 was an overwhelming Nixon landslide. Absolutely astounding, really. 520 electoral votes versus 17 for McGovern. McGovern only carried Massachusetts and Minnesota. Here's a more detailed map. You can see there's not a lot of blue out there. Nixon had won really a major victory here and headed toward his second administration with a great deal of power and a new kind of momentum to his presidency. Okay, so that's the background. Basically, Watergate, the burglary, comes as a result of Operation Gemstone. And between the break-in of June 17th, 1972, and Nixon's resignation, August 9, 1974, there's a great deal of activity. First break-in that takes place at DNC was actually earlier in May, on May 28th. The second break-in is where the burglars were apprehended. Um, Despite the best efforts of George McGovern, who ran a whole series of campaign ads on Watergate, despite the best efforts of the Washington Post, which took up the story, the public, for the most part, ignored Watergate, and Nixon won in November of 1972 in a landslide. 73 is when things start to fall apart in the Watergate crisis. Um, the five Watergate burglars faced trial, and they were tried in early 1973. Um, the judge in the case, John J. Sirica, who was the district court judge in Washington, D.C., imposed excessively hard sentences on the Watergate burglars in order to get the story out from them. In other words, to kind of apply pressure in order to get the true story of what happened here. And when James McCord, in March of 1973, wrote a letter to Sirica sort of outlining what was really a cover-up, the whole tenor of the Watergate thing, the whole Watergate crisis changed. March 21, 1973, things are really starting to fall apart. John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel, who had really become the head of the cover-up, met with Nixon. This is a famous meeting that he had with Nixon in which he described a cancer on the presidency. That's March 21st, 1973. May 17, the Senate Watergate Committee hearings began. Sam Ervin, of course, was the chair. The hearings continue through the summer of 1973. I remember I was glued to the tube. Uh, they had gavel to gavel. coverage. This is something fairly unusual in those days, very unusual. And it transfixed American public, really. Um, the most interesting part of the Senate committee, and the Senate committee had certain limitations, was the revelation on June 16th, 1971, that there was a White House taping system. This was done by Alexander Butterfield. He was one of two people who knew about the existence of the taping system. He was questioned by the Senate Watergate Committee, and he told the truth. And in other words, the whole crisis changed almost entirely as a result of the presence of the tapes. Now, Butterfield's an interesting character. He just died last week, actually, at the age of 99. Um, there are a lot of memoirs about Watergate, and in my view, there are not that many that are honest. The two most honest people involved in this crisis, in my opinion, were John Dean on the first to start with, and Butterfield as well. Very interesting character. He's only one of two people that knew about the existence of the taping system. H.R. Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff, was the other person who knew. And once the tapes become revealed, it becomes then a matter of obtaining access to the tapes. An ongoing struggle in 1973. Um, they spanned between 1971 and 73. Lyndon Johnson, Nixon's predecessor, did have a taping system. I don't think it was quite as extensive as Nixon's. Um, but almost immediately, the Watergate Committee zeroed in on certain conversations that they wanted to have recordings, and Nixon refused, claiming executive privilege. Meanwhile, a special prosecutor was appointed in May of 1973, Archibald Cox, and Cox was also pursuing the tapes. It was culminated on October 20th, 1973, when Nixon fired Cox during the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon told his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox. Richardson refused. Richardson had promised Cox that he wouldn't fire him, so he felt honor bound to resign. He resigned. His Assistant Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, also resigned, and it wasn't um, until you got to Solicitor General Robert Bork that Cox finally was fired. There was a firestorm that took place as a result of this, though, and Saturday Night Massacre really affected public opinion in very, very significant way. And it led, I think, after October of 1973, you have a different dynamic that's taking place in the crisis itself that lead to impeachment, ultimately impeachment and resignation. I like to say there are two tracks at work here from October of 73 until August of 1974. The first was the special prosecutor track. This was the case, the Watergate case, which was being pursued in the courts. And the second track was the House Judiciary Committee, which eventually did pursue impeachment. Leon Jaworski um, almost immediately was appointed to succeed Cox. The public outcry was so dire that he had to have another special prosecutor. Nixon picked Jaworski. He was a corporate lawyer in Houston, from Houston. Jaworski was a Republican. Nixon thought he'd be a safe choice. As it turned out, he wasn't. Jaworski was a systematic lawyer who pursued leads relentlessly. So you have sort of two tracks. The first is Jaworski. This is through the courts. And the second, the House Judiciary Committee. October 30th, only 10 days after Saturday Night Massacre, the House began the process of impeachment hearings. Republicans lined up in support of Nixon for the most part. Democrats lined up in opposition for the most part. The chair of the House Judiciary Committee was Peter Rodino. He was a congressman, longstanding congressman from New Jersey. He ran very, very consciously ran a set of hearings and proceedings that sought to be bipartisan. I think Rodinio recognized early on that um, this wasn't going to work unless you had bipartisan participation. And I think the history of impeachment will show that that's also true. So Rodinio was able to hire up. He hired a bunch of staff, um, among them John Doerr, who's the person on the left. Doerr is a really interesting figure. He was a very active during the Kennedy administration, during the civil rights crises of the early 1960s. To his left is Hillary Clinton. She worked for the impeachment inquiry under Rodinio, interestingly. So all of this it comes back to the tapes. And by the summer of 1974, Nixon has tried a variety of sort of ploys to try to avoid turning over the tapes. His most desperate ploy was that he would provide edited transcripts, um, and that didn't work. In fact, it backfired because as people read the edited transcripts, they saw a lot of what was going on in the White House, which was not high-minded and was not didn't seem to be. It seemed to be kind of crass, in fact. So culminates really with the Supreme Court decision, U.S. v. Nixon, July 25th, 1974. And it turned on, the question of separation of powers, but also the notion of executive privilege. And to simplify the decision, it was unanimous, which of course gave it a great deal of power. Um, it's it took on the concept of executive privilege, and on the one hand said that executive privilege did not shield crimes that were taking place. But on the other hand, it recognized executive privilege as actually a principle, constitutional principle. So it's sort of a two-sided sort of decision. But it did compel Nixon to turn over the tapes to Jaworski and eventually to the House Judiciary Committee. Um, Meanwhile, and this is taking place around the time of U.S. v. Nixon, the House Judiciary Committee adopted articles of impeachment. Three articles: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, contempt of Congress. There were, I think, 5 or 6 total, but the committee approved 3 of them. This went forward then, and the next stage would be a vote in the House on impeachment. That didn't ever occur. This all culminates with what is known historically as the smoking gun, which is one of the tapes that Nixon turned over and was forced to turn over in U.S. v. Nixon. The smoking gun was a conversation June 23rd, 1972, a conversation between Nixon and H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, in which they talk about Watergate. And they come up with the idea that the FBI could be told that this was a CIA operation and that they should back off, just simplifying what the ploy was. It never worked, but this became sort of the crucial piece of evidence about obstruction of justice and Nixon's involvement in a legal cover-up. August 5th, 1974. Once you get the smoking gun, things proceed very quickly after that. Immediately after that, Nixon is greeted by a group of leading Republican congressmen. That's Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona. And they advise him that he doesn't have the votes. He doesn't have the votes in the House to avoid being impeached, and he didn't have the votes to avoid being removed from office by a Senate vote. I think they said something like 8 or 9 votes he had in the Senate. So as a result, Nixon resigned. I want to play this isn't the total, it's not the total resignation speech, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort. As long as there was such a base, I felt strongly that it was necessary to see the constitutional process through to its conclusion, that to do otherwise would be unfaithful to the spirit of that deliberately difficult process and a dangerously destabilizing precedent for the future. But with the disappearance of that base, I now believe that the constitutional purpose has been served, and there is no longer a need for the process to be prolonged. I would have preferred to carry through to the finish, whatever the personal agony it would have involved. And my family unanimously urged me to do so. But the interests of the nation must always come before any personal considerations. From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Okay, so that's the only time in American history an American president has resigned. And this is obviously a major event in American history. Just briefly, I want to talk a little bit about why Watergate occurred. You know, why did the break-in occur? That's one of the mysteries, I think, of Watergate. Hasn't been completely resolved. This is Earl Silbert was the U.S. attorney for Washington who pursued the case in its early stages. Here's what he has to say.
To this day, I think the question of the motive for the break-in is uncertain. To this day, 35 years later. There have been lawsuits and claims about various reasons and all, and we certainly did look into it as best we could. And the Cubans were in there, according to them, to find out information relating to relations between Larry O'Brien and Castro and communism, and where McCord and Hunt and Liddy were coming from with respect to the information that they were looking for. It just didn't make sense. And the information they were getting, and there's a court order, so I have to be careful about what I can say about that, was, it just didn't spell out, a motive. And as I said, now they're some subsequent claims about other motivations leading to defamation and allegations of, prostitution rings and the like. Uh, you know, we asked everybody, but we certainly didn't get any clear answers.
Now, of course, some ask, what about the plan?
There's I won't play the Nixon clip, but basically he sees the whole thing as a mess that was created by Gordon Liddy. And I think there's probably some truth to that. Liddy was given a long leash, got into a number of things, but still it doesn't really answer uh, the immediate that Liddy is no longer with us, and he's going to take that secret to his grave. Deep Throat, of course, was the source that Woodward and Bernstein used. Mark Felt was revealed to be Deep Throat. He was the assistant director of the FBI under Hoover. Subsequently, it's the tapes reveal that they knew it was Felt, that Felt was Deep Throat. White Nixon knew it. Haldeman knew it. So that's interesting. He was assistant head of the FBI, and one of the things that occurred to Felt was he was not promoted to director. So there's that too as a motive for serving as a source. There's another theory, a Howard Hughes connection between O'Brien, the relationship between O'Brien and Howard Hughes, the billionaire industrialist. Hughes had made illegal payments to Nixon's friend, Charles B.B. Rebozo, in exchange for political favors. And after O'Brien became the DNC chair in 1970, Nixon administration grew paranoid that O'Brien would have knowledge of this relationship and be able to use it in the 72 campaign. So this is one theory. There's O'Brien. There's Rebozo. Very quickly, let me just mention a few aftermath consequences sort of factors here. First of all, a series of laws come in the 1970s that restrict presidential power. War Powers Resolution of 73, Ethics in Government, the FISA legislation of 78, Inspector General legislation 78, and then the Federal Election Campaign Acts of 1974. These were all things that were sort of in response to Watergate. Investigative journalism became popular, certainly. Woodward and Bernstein made a career out of it. All the President's Men was a bestseller, and the movie was a smash hit and earned 4 Academy Awards, 1976. I think the overriding thing, I'll conclude with this. Watergate brought a really dramatic decrease in public trust in government. If you look at this chart here, it's very dramatic in terms of the decline in the 1970s of faith in government, which was much more, I think, more prevalent before Watergate. Presidents' approval ratings are a struggle. One thing that we might sort of think about would be, why it did occur. Why was Watergate uncovered? That's another question, really, as compared to maybe the 21st century situation we're in. Okay, let me stop there, Judith, and I can, we do have some time for questions, so comments.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Bill. That was, I know for me, it was fascinating. I'm sure I speak to the same thing others are feeling. As a reminder, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're going to start, there's already some there, but there's definitely, anyone else is welcome to go ahead and add some. So I have a question here, Bill, from Matthew. He says, how do you view the full context of Alexander Butterfield's role? I know you mentioned he passed. How do you view the full context of his role in the scandal given his passing last week?
Well, as I say, I think he's sort of one of the people that emerges with a good odor out of this whole thing. I mean, he was honest, didn't try to cover up the fact that there was a taping system. And subsequently, over time, the Nixon Library has done a number of interviews with Watergate participants, and Butterfield's are really very impressive for his ability to see what was going on and then also to reflect on what it meant over time. Um, so again, I find him in the history of Watergate to be one of the more admirable characters. Um, I might say also Nixon. Nixon's a tragic figure, I think, in my view. We're 50 years away from it. The partisanship maybe is. I mean, as a historian, you're much better off if you have 50 years historical perspective. Judith?
Thank you. I have a question from Terry. Would you compare and contrast the role of the press during Watergate and the Nixon administration, and now during the second Trump administration?
Um, I think, well, there are a couple of major differences in 1972 to 74 versus where we are today. Um, to begin with, there's been a kind of fracturing of information. So people get information, they get news from a variety of sources, some of which are verified, some of which are not. Um, and in 1972, 74, there were basically three networks. That's all you had. You had public television. They aired the complete Watergate committee hearings. So it was a very different environment actually in the early 1970s. And the other thing I think is the intense partisanship that exists today, the hyper partisanship. That's made a huge difference. Where people's attitudes don't change. If you look at public attitudes toward Nixon in 72, 74, they do change. They're very, very responsive to news. And obviously, the information they're getting is the same. Hope that answers the question.
Talking about press or news, with the decline of local newspapers and the rise of the 24-hour news cycle, do we still have the journalism required to uncover a multi-year cover-up today?
Well, that's a good question. I think, in this past fall, I retired, but I was brought back by the University of Richmond to teach one course. It was a very nice arrangement. And the course I taught was Watergate. But I was struck with the fact that the students there didn't read newspapers. I mean, that's it's really quite astounding. So I kind of guilted them into reading the New York Times. I think in terms of information, it's very limited in terms of validated information that's out there right now. New York Times, the Washington Post obviously is affected. You've got all these media mergers that are taking place that are possibly going to affect the independence of the press. So it's very much a time, and we're in flux right now, clearly. And we'll probably have a better idea 5 years from now what the outcome of all of this is. We're right in the middle of it right now, though.
Thanks. Lex asks if you would please discuss what you see as the lessons of Watergate that have and have not been learned as the country grapples with another presidency that seems to have far outstripped Article 2 boundaries.
Well, I think one of the clear lessons is limits over presidential power. Um, and a lot of the expansion of presidential power goes beyond party politics. I mean, it does. It's not, you know, Democrats and Republicans both have been a party to it. But I think it's contributed to the paralysis that we have in the federal government right now, the inability of government to function. And the lack, as I mentioned in the talk, the lack of public confidence in government, that government does good things. Um, that's a radical departure, I think, from where it was, say, even 50 years ago. Um, let's see, I'm not sure that answers the question. Hopefully it does. Follow up if you want, Judith.
Lex, I'm hoping that answered your question. If not, feel free to post in the chat.
Yeah.
um, Steve says, why did you not mention the Senate hearings in Sam Urban?
Well, I really, it was a matter of time. I taught when I taught this course in the fall, I had 15 weeks. I don't have 15 weeks tonight, so um, but yeah, Irvin is, I mean, there's a Davidson connection with Irvin, very, very tight connection. Um, in fact, one of the early announcements of the committee's existence was announced on campus at Davidson. Um, so there is a connection with that. Irvin becomes a folk hero, and that's another story to tell for sure. He becomes Senator Sam. He's an expert on constitutional law. Interestingly, he's what's sort of forgotten is that he was one of the leading segregationists. He was, longstanding Southern senator from North Carolina. That's what you did if you were a senator from North Carolina in those days. Um, but yeah, I think the Urban Committee reaches a limit to what they can do by the fall of 1972. They simply can't do anything more. It has to go on a sort of a legal track. But clearly, this whole event was a major sort of phenomenon in American history and history of American media as well.
You touched on it, but just I do want to offer if there's anything else you want to add. Doug says, is there any comment on Senator Irvin's personal appeal and how it shaped public opinion? Or
Yeah,
Sam Irvin, sorry, Sam Irvin. Mhm.
yeah, very much so. He has sort of a folksy appeal. Um, and he had an ability to deal with witnesses. The thing about that committee was that it was very bipartisan. Howard Baker was the senator from Tennessee and was the minority member of the committee, ranking member. Um, and Baker originally was supposed to serve as a sort of spy for Nixon, but in the end, he sort of becomes one of Nixon's leading critics. Lowell Weiker's another one. So the dynamics of the committee are sort of interesting, I think. And Irvin epitomizes that. Um, One of the things they tried to do with the tapes, was constantly looking for a way out of the tape conundrum, um, was that Irvin was going to arrange for John Stennis to listen to the tapes and to edit transcripts based on his listening. Now, Stennis was also a segregationist from Mississippi, um, but he was also quite deaf. That didn't work too well. But anyway, so Urban is a major figure, but he's sort of a major figure early on. Once you get past September 73, it moves on into other things, particularly special prosecutor and impeachment.
Chris comments or asks, your graph showed that the decline in trust began 15 years before Watergate. What's the reason for that?
I'm not sure it does show that, but we can argue about that. Yeah, I don't think. Well, if you look at the dramatic dip, I won't pull the graph out again, but I think it does show consistent decline of public trust, and there are other measures. Um, they all rather consistently point to. Um, I mean, the '60s obviously was part of it too. It wasn't just Watergate, but it was this Vietnam clearly was a major part in the loss of public confidence. Once people begin to see that people are lying, the presidents lie. And during the Cold War, they do lie a lot. That undermines confidence in public trust in government. But that's where we are right now, clearly, I think. It's what's fueled Donald Trump a lot, I think, is this, belief in this drain the swamp and everything the federal government does is bad. Um, so
Keith asks, did Nixon know of the break-in prior thereto?
we don't have any evidence that he did. That's a good question. And I don't think he did. That would be my um, the principle of plausible deniability sort of applied to Nixon. Didn't want to know the details, but he did want to see the results. Um, there's no evidence of it. In other words, in the tapes that he had prior knowledge of what was going on, and he described Nixon described the plumber's operation as a Keystone Cops operation, which was very, very messy. So we don't have like it could be that he had prior knowledge. I think he didn't. The evidence sort of points in that direction.
Um, question in a very different direction, but interesting. Colin wants to ask, what memories stand out from your time at Davidson in relation to Watergate?
Well, I have very clear, well, to begin with, I remember the event when Irvin was announced. Um, and I think that was the spring of 73, sometime February, March. So I remember that quite well. Also, just the general ambience, well, to begin with, I come from a Davidson family, but I was a Yankee. So I was at Davidson and, I was amazed to see all these Nixon supporters around me. So that was part of it too, the campaign of 1972. Um, and then Saturday Night Massacre, I think that was very unnerving. Um, you felt um, you felt as a student, that your future was at stake here because it sort of combined with a variety of other factors that seemed to indicate that things were falling apart. Um, Remember that quite well.
These are not questions, and just for you to know, these are going on in the chat, Bill. There's a mention of the book, The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady, by Heath
Hmm.
Cartage Lee. And some folks are saying they've read it and they're finding that interesting and fascinating, as well as someone's reading the biography of Pat Nixon by Davidson Lum and enjoying that as well. Um, Jonathan asks, any comment about Nixon's resignation and the shame that it carried in those days and the lack of the shame that the modern politicians feel today?
Well, I think if you listen to that resignation speech, he he doesn't admit wrongdoing. I mean, that's part of what becomes part of the narrative that he tries to, you know, it's understandable. This is he Nixon was a good historian. He really understood, read a lot of history. He was very smart, and he certainly knew. I mean, the whole point behind the tapes really was to have some sort of documentation of his presidency that he could use later on. And here the thing is blowing up in his face. So I think the resignation um, was an acknowledgement of a political defeat rather than an acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong. And there's a really interesting series that you all are probably familiar with it of interviews that took place between David Frost and Richard Nixon in 1976. Frost was a British journalist, and uh, he paid Nixon $500,000 to do the interviews, and they were very, very extensive. And throughout the interviews, Nixon denies wrongdoing. So there's a very sort of clear insistence on Nixon's part that he doesn't want to acknowledge guilt. Um, the other thing I'd mention is about the tapes. There are 3,700 hours of tapes, and what happens after Watergate is a struggle over control of those tapes, interestingly. It's not until Nixon's death that all the tapes become available. And those have been assembled, very good collection. Actually, historian at University of Wisconsin, Stanley Cutler, published an edited collection of the transcripts that's really quite good. The other book I'd mention is Jared Graff, History of Watergate. That's the best book out there. I use that in my class. It's a compelling read too. It's long, but it's also very compelling. And then I would also recommend Thomas Mallon, Mallon, who wrote a historical fiction about Watergate, which is quite good. And I think he really sort of captures Nixon in there. But Nixon, I think, in the resignation speech, again, doesn't acknowledge guilt, and he carries that to his grave. It still becomes part of his. He's very concerned about his legacy, obviously, and very concerned about his position in history.
Well, thank you, Bill. I know we are just past 8:30. There are some more comments for folks to read, some folks' experiences that they're sharing here in the
Hmm.
chat, programs they've attended, books they've read, lived
Okay.
experiences. So definitely encourage everyone to continue reading the chat. At this time, I do want to thank Bill so very much for taking the time to speak with all of us today and leading us in this really engaging conversation. For everyone to know, a follow-up email will be sent with contact information for our speaker. It'll include a short survey and some other helpful information. Do note this event, I've had some questions. This event was recorded, and it will be available on our same website where these classes were listed somewhere in the next few days. So be on the lookout for that. Bill, did you have any other final comments or things you wanted to share?
No, it's I would say I found it's challenging to compress all of this into 40 minutes. So I spent a long time trying to do it. Hopefully, it was successful. But it's a subject. Hopefully, this is just a beginning because there's a lot of things one could read. The literature on Watergate is really, really extensive, and I would encourage everyone to do that if they can.
Absolutely. I feel pretty confident when I speak for most of us on the call that we can say we understand that was a good challenge for you. So we thank you for sharing again this really key information. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. We really appreciate you dialing in and taking the time to participate. Bill, I don't know if you see in the chat, but you're getting lots of well wishes and great
Yes, you
jobs.
are.
So I'm thinking folks enjoyed
Yeah.
it. So
Okay.
thanks to Bill, thanks to everyone, and hope everyone has a lovely rest of your evening.